Lee, anything we can do there?
Can you hear me?
Yes, yes.
Okay. Now I can't hear you. So
Oh, no.
hold on. Okay, now talk.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, okay, we're good.
I feel like we're in a phone commercial.
It was it kept doing this weird thing where it kept saying, you must restart. You must restart. Anyway.
No.
Hi.
Thank you so much for joining us, especially when you're not even in town. We appreciate that.
I'm at a friend's house. So yeah, all is well. I'm happy to be here, but when I knew I was going to be away for the weekend, I was like, oh no. And then Amy, we hadn't talked in a little while, so I was like, maybe it got canceled.
No.
So I brushed my hair for y'all.
Awesome. Awesome.
All right, well, tell me what y'all want to talk about. Can you hear me okay?
Well, we definitely appreciate you joining us. I have to tell you that Becoming Mrs. Lewis was my mom's favorite book of last year. I gave it to her for a gift, and it was her favorite book of last year. So I want to start off by asking you, if you were going to give someone a gift of one of your books other than Becoming Mrs. Lewis, which one would you choose?
Oh, wow. I'd get a boxed set of all 15 and put a bow on it. That's a great question. Amy, that's a stumper. I don't know if I've ever been asked that. I think probably I would say The Bookshop at Water's End or The Favorite Daughter, just because those really show what my writing is about. Recently, they re-released the first book I ever wrote that's 16 years old, and it's called Losing the Moon. So sometimes it's fun to read Losing the Moon and then read Becoming Mrs. Lewis to see how different they are after 16 years and how much, not how much I changed, but kind of, we all, there's an evolution, there's a change in time. So, yeah.
That was a selfish question. I just wanted to know which one to send her next.
Okay, send her The Bookshop at Water's End. I think that's a good start. I think it's a good start.
And we'll jump in on a book question now. You wrote this novel in first person. Why did you choose this rather than third person narration?
So, which leads also to the question of why I even bother to tell her story in fictional form instead of as a biography. So usually those two questions, they dovetail. Because for the same reason that I chose to tell it as a historical fiction is the same reason I chose to tell it in the first person. And that's because the story had never been told from her point of view. The story had never been told from anyone's point of view but his or in biography. And all the biographies I read were full of a lot of opinion, which is not what biographies are meant to include. And that's fine. They were incredibly researched biographies, and I couldn't have written this book without them. But I felt like nothing had been told from her point of view. Even Shadowlands, which is the movie most people know about Joy Davidman, is completely from his point of view and is completely about what happened to him and how he felt when she died. Most of us know the book that C.S. Lewis wrote called A Grief Observed, which is one of the seminal books on grief of the 20th century, and he wrote that about her death. So we mostly know about what he felt, but what about her? And so I made a decision really early on that I was tired of hearing about her. I only wanted to hear from her. And because we have so much of her writing, we have her letters, we have her books, we have her essays, we have her poetry, most important. And because we have all of that, I knew I wanted to only hear from her. So to do that, I needed to write from the seat of her heart. I needed to write from behind her eyes, and I needed to write from the key of empathy. And to do that, I needed to write in the first person.
Excellent answer. How many months did you spend researching this novel, and can you tell us about your research process?
Oh, wow. Y'all settle in. This is like a really long answer. I'll try to make it brief. It's Sunday afternoon. By the way, can I just say thank you for showing up on a Sunday afternoon? Aren't y'all so tired of meeting on like the Brady Bunch squares instead of in person? I would love to be sitting at the library with y'all. So it was a couple years worth of research. I always say it was a couple years versus a research and my whole life, because I've been reading Lewis all of my life. So I knew enough about him to get started. I didn't have to start from scratch. Otherwise, I'd still be doing research because his life is so, I mean, scholars spend their whole lives studying C.S. Lewis. So, you know, I wasn't trying to cover his whole life. For me, she was the main thing. So it was a few years of reading and research, and my research was done in layers. It was done first by reading her work. And so I read her poetry, her essays, her novels, her letters are like reading her journal. Her letters are incredible. And then I reread most of the work of Lewis in the last 13 years of his life, which is when he knew her or she had passed, to see what her fingerprints were in his work. Then when I felt like I had that pretty much down, I went to a place called the Mary. And the Wade Center holds all the important papers of the 7 most important British authors of that time. So they have Tolkien, they have G.K. Chesterton, they have George MacDonald, they have Dorothy Sayers, they have Charles Williams, and of course they have Lewis. And because they have Lewis's papers, they have Joy's papers. So I went and sat in their research library and drove the research librarian crazy, and now we're really good friends, about every last dot of things I could find about Joy that was unpublished, because I had already read everything that was published. So she would bring me out box after box of her handwritten notes, the oral biographies from her son. And then when I was finished with that, and I had a rough draft, I organized a trip to London and Oxford. And the reason that I waited till the very end to do that was multifold. One, I wasn't positive what I was going to do with this story. I wasn't exactly sure if I was even going to show it to anyone. I wrote this book in secret. And I also wasn't positive I wanted it to be a novel. I wasn't sure whether I wanted it to be an article. So I waited till the novel was done. I had the rough draft, and I organized a trip called In the Steps of Joy. And I went everywhere in London and Oxford that you read about in the book. So there's nowhere that you read about that I didn't visit except for Edinburgh, Scotland, and her house in upstate New York. So everywhere you read about, I visited, pretending I was her. What would it feel like? And lucky for us, London and Oxford just aren't that different than they were in 1950. London's a little, the most different, because in 1950 it still had bombed out spaces from the war. But Oxford is pretty much exactly the same as it was in 1950. So I could walk into Magdalen's dining hall, which she did, and imagine what it must have felt like for her, or walking Addison's Walk with Lewis behind Magdalen College along the River Cherwell. It's just not that different. So I tried to infuse, and I hope it worked, I tried to infuse the novel at that point with what it felt like to be in those places as her. And then the last and final thing I did was, through a crazy set of amazing and synchronistic and serendipitous circumstances, I met her son before the book was published. And I had to get some permissions, because as you can tell by reading the book, every chapter starts with one of her love sonnets or a piece of her poetry. And then he gave me even more stuff to put in the book. So it wasn't like this. And the book I just finished is historical fiction, and the research was completely different. So there's no like single way to do the research for historical fiction. And for Joy, because it was about a person and not an event, it was done in layers. Like, first read her work, get the cadence of her voice, understand what she thought, understand what she wanted. Then go to read her unpublished and private papers, then go to the places she lived, and then talk to a relative of hers. That was the very last thing I did. So I did it in these layers, and the whole time I was writing. So it wasn't like I did that and then sat down and wrote. I was doing it, writing, doing it, writing, doing it, writing.
Wow. You were extremely successful, I have to say.
Oh, thank you. Thank you.
I'm wondering if you'll tell us anything about what you're currently working on. Absolutely. And when we might
see it.
Hear something about this being available.
I love talking about this book. So you asked the right question. So my new book comes out in March of 21. So, you know, what are we, 8 months out? Are y'all done with 2020? I know I am. Raise your hand if you're done. Okay, thank you. All the hands. So it comes out in March of 21, and it is based on the true life ship tragedy of a ship called the Pulaski, and it carried all the elite of Savannah and Charleston north for the summer. And it was a steamship, and it blew up off the coast of Wilmington, North Carolina, and sank. And the stories, it's called Surviving Savannah, and the stories of their survival are astounding. And then there is a modern day story, because that shipwreck has been found. It was found about 3 years ago, January 3 years ago. And so I have a modern day story of a museum curator who is helping bring up the artifacts from the ship while telling us the story of that night. And I knew I wanted to write about it, but as I was doing my research, I discovered that there was a family of 12 that boarded that ship together. And what makes it even more interesting is, of that family of 12, the father was the owner and the financier for the ship. And he brought his wife, his 6 children, his sister, and his niece on that ship, and then it blew up. And of course, not all of them survived. So you'll have to read to find out who does. But the echoes and the ramifications of him taking his family of 12 on a ship that he financed and was proud of is echoes till now, especially in Savannah. So as soon as I knew I wanted to write about that ship. I wasn't sure how I was going to approach it. I'll tell you one kind of creepy thing that happens when you're writing sometimes, like meeting Doug. I decided I was going to write about the ship in January 3 years ago. This was a really hard book to write about. By the time it comes out, it will have been 4 years since I decided to write about it. And I started to do the research. I started to write about it. It was going to be only historical. And I sat down one morning in my office and was trying to Google what time it blew up, because I was making an outline. And an article popped up that it had just been found. I know. So I had those chills, the one that lets you know you're on the right path. And I immediately contacted the shipwreck hunter, and he's been working with me ever since to make sure that I'm getting things right, and been showing me real pieces and real things they bring up, and I put them in the book, and it's been fascinating. And I discovered also that nobody had ever made a full manifest of the ship. Things are out there about this ship, but there's no book about this ship, this sinking of this ship. There's chapters in books, but there's no one book on this ship. And so I'm the first person that put together a full manifest of the ship. And now I have a full manifest, who lived, who died, and how. So it's really fascinating.
Wow, that's awesome. That's just another great reason to look forward to 2021.
I know, right? Hurry, it's like I want to take a fishing hook and like grab it and then pull it in. Like, you know.
I for one wish you could.
Now get us through this fall. Can we sleep through this fall?
Yes. Lewis and Davidman's marriage was unconventional for their time. It was more like marriages of now. What drew you into writing about their relationship?
So I always knew, like I said at the beginning, that he had written this seminal book on grief about her. So I always had this question: who was this astounding woman that C.S. Lewis didn't marry till he was 57? And then he wrote this book about her that, you know, that most people, when they're going through their own grief, feel like they have someone walking alongside them. And so the more I learned about her, at first when I started writing this, I thought I was just writing a love story about an American woman who wrote a letter to an Oxford Don, and they fell in love over letters, or she fell in love with him over letters. And then, you know, they got together. I thought it would be a sweet, short love story. I had no idea. Just like the shipwreck, I had no idea what I was getting myself into. It sounded like a very simple story to tell. And as soon as I started diving in, I almost said, I'm not doing this, because it was so complicated. I didn't realize she was married with 2 kids to an abusive husband, that she went to England twice. Then there's, I'm assuming y'all read it, but if not, I'll try not to spoil too much. Then there's the whole cousin situation. So I'd never heard any of that. And then 9 years ago, maybe 10 now, time is slippery these days. They found her son was helping Joy's best friend clean out her house because she was moving to a nursing home. And they found a box of Joy's personal papers in the back of a closet. And in that box were 300 unpublished poems. And of those 300 unpublished poems, there was a folder that had the word courage on it. And inside that folder were 45 love sonnets for C.S. Lewis. And so I knew that the story was much bigger than just this sweet love story about an American woman who wrote a letter to an Oxford Don, that it was a very complicated, not easy, because there's times in the book, I think all of us, I think I'll get another hand raise, there's times in the book that all of us, including me, were frustrated with her. What are you doing? Why would you do that? And I really want, thank you, Barbara. And I just felt like we had to see the full complicated story for the redemption of the story, which is their love story, to really hit home. It wasn't some simple, pretty love story like in a novel. It was very complicated, and she was very complicated. So
I'm going to turn over the second half of our interview to my colleague, Dr. Lee Davis.
Hi, Lee.
Hey.
Where are you? You look like you're in the library.
I'm in the library. Woo.
You're in the stacks. I'm jealous. I can see them. I miss the library like crazy.
Oh man, it's been a long, strange trip to get back in here. So,
So are you open yet? Are we open?
We're hoping very soon. We're trying to do some things to make it safe as possible, and okay. We're hoping certainly by the end of the month. Knock on wood. So yeah, exactly. I know when you write about women from previous generations, it's tempting to look at them in light of our contemporary ways of expressing gender. And given that David Mann was not retiring and rather expressed her very strong intellect freely, more like women now, how'd you keep yourself focused on what you imagine her understanding of gender roles to be without recreating her like a woman today?
So that was one of the more complicated and harder things to write about. I had to, more than any book I've ever written, I had to stay in her point of view. I had to stay in 1948, which is kind of really where the book gets rolling. And then she died in the year 1960. So I had to keep going back again and again and again, like a touchstone, to what the environment around her was at the time. For example, there's a quote that's well known in Joy circles that her husband once said, which is, because her husband, as you know, was also a writer, and he said, every writer needs 2 things to be successful: a wife and a typewriter, and they both must be in working order. Now, I mean, right? I want to slap him in the face. So you have to realize, and I have to remember, that would have sent me into a rage and probably packing my bags. But wait, did we lose her? Where'd she go? Did she leave?
She came back.
Oh, okay. I was like, where did Lee go? And because I was looking at you while I was talking, and then you went away. So we have to remember that she was in a time where it was funny to say that, right? Where her friends might not have even been appalled. And I think too that that was part of the problem at first. And I show it with Tolkien in the pub scene, that the other men in England were appalled. What is she doing showing that she's smarter than us? What is she doing showing she can out-debate us? By the way, what is a married woman with 2 children doing in the pub? You know, there was just a lot of idealizing or not idealizing who she was. And so I couldn't ignore that in the book, right? I had to show that she was struggling against that lead just as much as she was struggling against the fact that Lewis didn't yet love her the way that she loved him. She was struggling against this constant belief that she was stepping out of line, that she was stepping out of her place, that she was bucking convention, and in a way that was negative and would hurt her and her children. There wasn't one person, not even Belle Kaufman, who was saying, you know what, you go for it. You save your own life. You save your children's life. I always say that Joy, I think, would have loved the poetry of Mary Oliver and that great poem where the last line is, and then she saved the only life she could save, her own. And so I think it's Wild Geese, but she does not have to crawl on her knees and beg forgiveness. She gets to save the only life she would have saved, which is her own. And so in today, it would, first of all, they would have been emailing each other. They wouldn't have been writing letters. And so I just felt like I had to stay in that time period and keep that in mind.
Sorry.
Okay, there we go.
Oh,
And so that's how I did it. I just had to keep touching the touchstone of 1948, 1950. And remember that every decision she made was unsupported by not only family, but convention and time.
man, wow. I am a fiend addicted to podcasts. I love them. And I really enjoyed your podcast.
Thank you. That means a lot to me. Thank you.
I mean, I got into it. I was listening in the car. I was listening everywhere. It's awesome. Why did you decide to do that accompanying podcast with the novel?
Well, first of all, like you, I'm a podcast junkie. So I listen to loads of podcasts. And I'd never seen anybody do it. I realize now, I think there are a couple, but I'd never seen anybody do it for a fiction book. And so I was talking to my publishing house one evening, right after the book came out, about how much of my research ended up on the cutting room floor. That book could have been a trilogy, easy, because both of their lives are so rich and fascinating. But nobody wants to wait 3 books to see Lewis say, I love you to her, right? So I couldn't write a trilogy. Nobody would have waited that long or read all 3 of them. They would have given up. So I was so kind of in despair about all the research on the cutting room floor that didn't end up in the book, because the other touchstone that I had to keep going back to over and over was that if a scene or a piece of research didn't touch the live wire of her transformational journey, it didn't get to stay. So I lost all these interesting things I learned because they were interesting for me, but you would have lost the thread of the story. And it was a long enough book as it was. So we started talking about what to do with that information. Do I write a nonfiction book about the lessons that Joy taught me? Do I write like a kind of like, this is the backstory, kind of small, slim volume that you could accompany it? And then I said, I'm a podcast lover. I think we should do podcasts. And they were like, ding, 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 ding. So I gathered the 7, 8, 9 people that I talked to when I was doing my research, or that I talked to after, and then ended up changing a few things. And so I dove into a lot of things that aren't in the book, but are really interesting. And I talked to 2 of the podcasts are with her son. One is with the man who is the expert on those love sonnets. And I did not talk to him till the book was done. I read his books, his 2 published books about her poetry. So I read his books, and I interviewed him on and off by email, but I never spoke to him voice to voice until we did that. And that's one of the few podcasts that was done face to face in a studio. We were looking at each other doing that. So it's one of my favorites. But yeah, and then there's a couple women who are experts on the women in Joy's life, including Dorothy Sayers, who is another amazing and fascinating woman. taught herself Italian so that she could translate Dante. I mean, she's just unbelievable. And it is said that Douglas said he only saw C.S. Lewis cry twice. Once was when Dorothy Sayers died, and once was when his mother died. So when Joy died. So we talk about Dorothy Sayers, and then we talk about his mother, how fascinating she was. So the podcast was just this grabbing of information that's wove into the story, but we could dive a lot deeper in the podcast. And I'm so glad you enjoyed it, because I think it makes the book more interesting, and I think it spreads. If you have any interest in knowing more about Lewis or her, that's a great place to go.
Well, the one I'd like to learn more about is Douglas, because first off, that portion of the podcast, I was really touched the whole time listening to him talk about these adults in his childhood life. And his description of he and his brother's really troubled childhood and the subsequent problems his brother had as an adult. What's your impression of him, and how much did you rely on his memories that he shared with you while you were working on the book?
So I didn't rely that much on his memories when I was working on the book, for a couple of reasons. One, he was 9 when she moved there. And 2, she was his mother. So not only was he turned 9 on the ship on the way to England. So our memories are not reliable at best when you're 9, and they're definitely not reliable about our own parent. So I did rely on his memories for later, like when she was really sick, because he was 15 at the time. But otherwise, like I said, I relied on her. I just only read her words. I didn't rely on biographers' opinions or other people's opinions or Bill's mean opinion, because I was writing from her point of view. So I didn't rely on his opinions or the things he told me that much for the novel, except for a couple places when she was really sick. Douglas is really interesting. He has been the keeper of Lewis's estate and world since he was 18 or 19 years old. So that's been his whole life. I think, as all of us know, that our narrative about things change with age and time. And he's, in his 70s, which is young, but he's been talking about this since he was in his late teen years. So his identity is very much wrapped up in being C.S. Lewis's stepson and Joy Davidman's son. But he's very, very, very interesting to talk to. And he just sold all of Narnia to Netflix, all rights to Narnia to Netflix. And I keep wondering what Lewis would think of that. I don't know. But, I'm glad I get to see the movies. But, yeah, he's very interesting. But I didn't rely on him that much to write this book. But I've relied on him to be kind, and we keep in touch. And he was incredibly helpful when I had to go through permissions to get permission for the things I used. He's amazing about the book. He only talks well of it. So I've been really grateful for him and his friendship. But I didn't rely on him that much for the portion of the book that mattered to me, which is Joy's transformational journey. And for example, he would really like to think that his mother didn't love another man when she was married to his father, and that she didn't love him until she got sick. I'm like, have you read her poetry? So, yeah.
Yeah. Well, Warnie Lewis, in my opinion, is overlooked as an influence by a lot of fans. And because, he was his brother's closest companion. Yep. He's even buried with his brother.
Together. They're buried in the same grave.
Yeah. So what influence do you think he had on, Jack and Joy's relationship, and what do you think he thought about his sister-in-law?
So if there was anybody who ever supported Jack and Joy, it was Warnie. Warnie loved Joy so much. And let me back up by saying, I agree with you. I think Warnie is an amazing, interesting man in his own right. And he didn't write popular books like Jack did or like C.S. Lewis did, but he was just as prolific a writer. He wrote history books, mainly French. And so he was in the army for most of his life. And he had PTSD too. That's why he was a binge alcoholic. But he had a lot of leftover psychological stuff from the war because C.S. Lewis was only in the war for a year. Warney was a career army in the war. And so by the time he moved in with his brother, they never lived apart. Warney never married. He never, he lived with Jack for the rest of his life. And he was a brilliant history writer. And Joy and Warney worked together on a lot of projects. And Warney loved her so much. He called her his sister. He wanted them to get married. He went to Joy when they were getting ready to get married and said, I'll move out of the house so you can move in. And she said, absolutely not. We're all family. You're not moving out. And it is said that Jack turned to Warney for comfort when Joy died. And Warney was so distraught and went on such a bad bender, he couldn't even be there for his brother. So Warney was always on Team Joy from the very beginning. And Warney kept an intricate diary. And it's at the Wade Center, and I think it's published. And there's a line that he wrote back when Joy and Jack were writing letters to each other that says, we have received a letter from the most fascinating American woman. So Joy grabbed Warney's attention from day one. So
that is really cool. Kind of going out on a sideline here, there's a misogynist myth that Truman Capote wrote To Kill a Mockingbird and gave it to Harper Lee. And I would argue that she deserved a co-writing credit on In Cold Blood because he would have never been able to put that book together without her work and support. Are there books of Lewis's that you would argue should have a shared author credit with Davidman?
100%. So there's only one that I would make the, factual art. The man who's a specialist on this, his name is Andrew Lazo, and he's one of my podcasts. Actually, he's two of them. And he is the expert on how Joy co-wrote Till We Have Faces with C.S. Lewis. So Till We Have Faces is C.S. Lewis's last novel. And he says, in Lewis's words, by far and away my best novel. And it is a retelling of the myth of Cupid and Psyche. And in my novel, there's a whole scene where he feels like he's at a dead end. He has just taken his job at Cambridge. He feels like he's having a writer's block. He's hit a dead spell. He can only write nonfiction. And he's finished Narnia by then. All 7 Narnia are out by now. And she just starts talking to him and making him spitball and brainstorm. And what have you tried before and put away? And he told her about Cupid and Psyche. And he wrote the first chapter that night, and then she co-wrote that book with him, and they are all over that book. Their relationship is in that book. The way they talk about masks and true self is in that book. Joy's transformation from a woman who doesn't believe in God to a woman who sees her true self in God. All of it is in Till We Have Faces. And so anybody who's done the research knows that she should be written as a co-author on that book, and she never was. Andrew believes that Lewis offered it to her, and she said no, that it would detract from the sales of the book. It was his book. He wrote it. She helped. He wrote it. And I don't know. Nobody knows if that's true or not true, but she should definitely have been a co-author in that book. It's pretty well proven.
Excellent. One of our group members, Lisa, has a question for you, so I'm going to throw to her.
Okay, hi, welcome, Patti.
Hi, Lisa.
Did Joy's letters actually survive? Because you have them in the book, you have them all destroyed by Lewis because he didn't want hangers-on getting a hold of them.
Yeah, it's true, Lisa. So he did destroy all the letters, so we don't have any of her letters. So the letters that you read in my novel, they aren't full letters. I don't know how many of y'all have read it yet, but I just have snippets to kind of guide us, because one of my most difficult decisions was how to show how they fell in love, friendship love, but fell in love during that almost 3 years of pen friendship, he called it. And so I had to show that. I couldn't just tell you. So what I did is I read all the letters they wrote to other people during that time.
Okay.
And by reading what they wrote to other people during that time, I could pretty much extrapolate what they were writing to each other, but with more of a personal bent. And then there's a few places where Joy, in Joy's published letters and in her unpublished letters at the Wade, where she talks about what Lewis wrote to her. So I don't have the exact words, but I have the gist of what he wrote to her, because she would say, you know, he believes this, or he told me that. And so I could put that in a letter, but the actual letters are gone. But I made sure that they were things they both would have talked about during that time.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Anybody else want to chime in with a question?
Did I answer everything?
Amy, how are we fixed for time?
Amy, can you hear us?
I think if you've got another question you want to ask, go ahead and ask it.
Okay, if you're good with that, I will do that. Let's see. David Mann was avid about politics, and I love the story about her making the 14 top leave a restaurant because they wouldn't serve African Americans. How do you think her strong political and social justice beliefs impacted her life and work?
Oh, I think it impacted it greatly. I think, you know, it was part of what we talked about before, Lee, about bucking convention. She had this really deep sense of just and unjust. And so it's what, I mean, if you read the book, you know, she went through a period where she joined the Communist Party, which she will admit was a huge mistake. She said she did it in an emotional burst during college. She was sitting in her college dormitory and studying for exams, and it was during the Great Depression. And she looked up and she saw a young girl standing on top of one of the school buildings at Hunter College in New York, which is where she matriculated and went to college. And she watched the young girl jump off the building and take her own life. And she found out later it was because she was hungry, and she knew that her mom could only feed so much of the family, and she had brothers and sisters. And Joy was, as you can tell by reading the book, Joy was a very emotional person. And so in this great, in her words, great burst of emotion, she joined the Communist Party thinking how unjust and unfair it was that there was those with and those without. She left the party really quickly. She obviously realized that wasn't the right path, but she had this real sense of what was fair and unfair and just and unjust. So that's a really good question. Where would she fall today in this turbulent world? And I would never try to answer for her, but I can tell you wherever she fell, she would be vocal about it. I don't think she'd be very quiet about it. And I don't think she would care that much what other people thought about what she said. And if she did care, she would care more about saying it than offending.
Excellent. All right, that's all my
Patti,
questions.
thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you guys for coming tonight and spending your Sunday evening with me. Thank you. And hopefully we'll see all each other soon at the library.
Wouldn't that be lovely?
Soon, please, soon. Y'all take care out there. Be safe, all of that. Thanks for having me, Amy. We'll talk soon.
Thanks, Patti.
Okay,
Bye-bye.
bye.
And I want to remind everybody else that if you want to get a copy of next month's book, you can email christy.calvin@hooverlibrary.org. Her email address is in the chat function. It's Christy, Kristie.Calvin. And